Okay, well, we are down to the last video of this lecture, except for class business, and I'm just going to warn you, out my window, which is behind my computer, there are people walking on the street in my neighborhood with their dogs, and Silas keeps looking out the window and listening, and he barks at them from time to time, so I'm just going to warn you, you might hear random barking for that reason. So the last thing I want to say before we end lecture for today is, all right, look. So we've got this proposed category of internet addiction. I've talked about the theoretical background. I've talked about where it came from. I've talked about the proposals for why it might exist. I focused on the proposed criteria for, in particular, internet gaming disorder or video game addiction. I told you why people are focusing on internet gaming disorder or video game addiction as potentially its own unique category and important category. Let's end today's lecture with what the experts say. Is there agreement? Is there disagreement? What the hell is going on with regard to the concept of pathological gaming? Pathological gaming. The reason I'm focusing on this is because, as I said in a prior slide, internet gaming disorder, pathological gaming, video game addiction, whatever you want to call it, has been found to be the most predictive in terms of problems in the person's life as a result of internet overuse. And because it tends to be something we see in younger people, adolescents and college students, it has gained a lot of attention. And, sorry, one more thing. As I alluded to on a prior video, I'm going to begin next class with a discussion about some of the controversial laws and policies that some countries have developed as a result of this so-called video game addiction or internet disorder with gaming, internet gaming disorder or pathological gaming in young people. So let's ask the experts. In 2015, a researcher by the name of Ferguson found a majority of surveyed clinicians and surveyed behavioral scientists. So let's talk about that for a minute. Some folks are primarily practicing clinicians. They're not really doing any research. They're seeing patients in their clinical practice. Some folks are primarily behavioral scientists. They're studying the phenomenon of interest, but not actively seeing patients and treating them. Some people are both scientists, practitioners, where they both see patients and treat them, but they also conduct research. So in 2015, a researcher by the name of Ferguson studied through survey research, gave a survey, anonymous survey to clinicians and also to behavioral scientists or scholars. So he wanted to separate out what people who only treat folks with this so-called pathological gaming problem think and what people who only research it, not people who do both. Here's what he found. A majority of clinicians, so close to 62%, agreed that pathological gaming was a problem, which means that nearly 30% were skeptical of the concept of pathological gaming as clinically relevant. Ferguson and Caldwell in 2017, so 2 years later, found only roughly 30% of scholars, so behavioral scientists who study the phenomenon, agreed that pathological gaming is a serious problem. In general, these researchers found across bodies of their data in different studies that clinicians seem to give more credence to the concept than behavioral scientists. So in other words, clinicians think it's more of a potentially clinically relevant problem. Behavioral scientists think not so much. They're more skeptical that this might be over-pathologizing ordinary behavior and not really clinically problematic or a disorder. In 2019, so again 2 years later, Ferguson, the same Ferguson and colleagues, wondered, based on their research in a paper they wrote, they were sort of talking about the impact of this research and what it should mean. Is it possible clinicians may be overly quick to see, quote unquote, or recognize or diagnose, even though it's not really a disorder, pathological gaming in patients? And is that more diagnostic bias and theoretical bias? Meaning, are they invested in the concept and they believe in the concept and they have theoretical reasons they think such a thing exists, so they're sort of confirming their own bias And they're diagnosing it because once we believe something, of course, we look for it, right? Researchers call this the confirmation bias. It's a cognitive heuristic or rule of thumb that people use. And it helps us to make quick decisions on the one hand, but it also often gives us the wrong conclusion, right? So if you think about the saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, that's because of the confirmation bias. Once I think I know something about how a person is, I constantly look for evidence and overweight that evidence to confirm what I already believe. And in doing so, I'm missing evidence that counters what I believe, right? So if I think someone is a great person, we also call this the halo effect. We have names for everything in psychology and psychological science. If I've concluded that you're a great person, you're like an angel, the halo effect, then I'm constantly looking for and overweighting evidence that confirms what a good person you are. And I might be missing or explaining away times when you're not so good and you do things that are kind of shitty. Similarly, if clinicians believe in pathological gaming and believe that that is a form of addiction, they might be looking for evidence that it exists and missing all kinds of things in their patients that are not consistent with an addiction, so to speak. And so they have a bias in confirming it and in diagnosing it. And we call this diagnostic bias. We call this also being theory versus research driven. If you already have a theory of something, it's easy to look for things to confirm it. But if you don't have data collected to really confirm empirically with neutral information, not your own bias, that something makes sense, you might believe in something that doesn't have a lot of research data to support it. That's why we have other precarious diagnoses that have been very controversial in the history of psychology and still are today. Things like whether or not multiple personality disorder, which is now really called dissociative identity disorder. You've probably seen movies about this, right? Or read the story of Sybil, somebody who supposedly has multiple different people living in their head, so to speak, with different identities, and they seem unaware of these different people taking control of consciousness. Repressed memory syndrome, the idea that if something traumatic happens to somebody, they could completely put it out of consciousness, not have any awareness of it, and yet it's still in their unconscious in some form, like abuse. These are just two of many controversial diagnoses and concepts and theories that have been said to be put forth by clinicians who are too zealous, too excited about this idea, and they look for evidence of it despite what the research indicates to the contrary. More reason for concern is that clinicians have been offering treatment for many different so-called behavioral addictions that we've talked about, like sex addiction, like sports or exercise addiction, like workaholism, like, exercise, like I said, exercise addiction, like shopping addiction, and yet none of these are officially recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So we should be concerned when clinicians are starting to diagnose and treat, and remember, this involves money, conditions that are not recognized by the very governing body of their profession, right? Next, there are concerns that, quote, normal behavior is being over-pathologized. And things that people do for recreation, things that people do as a hobby, for fun, for enjoyment, for even stress relief. We're allowed to do things to relieve stress in life. These things are now becoming pathological, becoming pathologized, being treated as if they are abnormal and something in need of treatment. So the idea that these are sort of alarmist, we're starting to say, oh no, everything people do for recreation can become an addiction and is bad for you. And the idea that gaming, which is fun and an enjoyable activity and recreational, the idea that it should be compared with something like heroin or meth is disturbing for many people in psychological science and over-pathologizing normal behavior that could and should be used, if it works, for recreation and even stress relief and enjoyment. Finally, although there is some allusion to research, suggesting that the same areas of the brain are triggered and the same chemicals in the brain are triggered by excessive internet use like gaming, particularly the dopaminergic pathways in the brain that you know oh so much about after our addiction lectures. The research actually suggests that dopamine is released in a lot of behaviors that we make that are not pathological and not addictive. Dopamine, remember, mediates pleasure and reward, right? So I can eat, a really tasty, yummy meal and I'll release dopamine. I can kiss somebody I'm attracted to and release dopamine. The idea that dopamine gets released doesn't make something pathological. It doesn't make it an addiction. So that's a bit of a slippery slope when we start to say, oh, studies show that people who are internet gaming a lot release a lot of dopamine, just like people who snort coke. We release dopamine for a lot of pleasurable activities that are recreational, that are fun, that are part of normal human life. So let's finish with slide 16. Again, this is from the same review article by Ferguson and colleagues I alluded to in 2019. The concern is, and this thing I'm about to say will kind of set us up for next class, there are actually warning messages on some digital games that say things like, remember to take all things in moderation. World of Warcraft has this. These are analogous to the health warnings we see on tobacco and alcohol. So we're basically communicating that we need to have like a rating system or warnings because you might become addicted to internet gaming. And this seems alarmist to those who suggest this isn't even a recognized disorder yet, and we're starting to over-pathologize recreational behavior. They argue that such warning messages are really inappropriate because, for example, we don't see warning messages at gyms that say, hey, be careful if you run on the treadmill too much, you might get addicted to exercise. Or in shopping malls, we don't walk into a store at the Walden Galleria and see messages that say, hey, don't spend too much time here, you might get addicted to buying shoes. And we don't even see messages on social media. You don't go into Instagram or Facebook and see a warning message pop up that says, warning, if you stay on here too long talking to your friends, you might become addicted to the internet. So why the hell are we seeing warning messages on games? That's the argument that these researchers are making, that it's kind of ridiculous to be having warning message for just one of multiple activities we engage in the course of our daily lives for recreation and for pleasure, and even, hey, for stress relief. The idea that well-established effects, strongly researched negative consequences of tobacco and alcohol are the same as potentially negative effects of internet gaming is, as researchers say, hyperbole. Hyperbole is a really fancy word for that's really exaggerating. That's really exaggerating. So these researchers even said in their 2019 article, why not then extend similar warnings to gardening, dancing, running, exercising, and literally every other hobby people engage in for fun. Can you imagine going to Home Depot and going into the garden center or Lowe's garden center, and as you walk in, there's a big sign that says, warning, you might get addicted to planting flowers. I don't think so. Current evidence suggests that the time spent engaging with digital internet games is actually not a very good predictor of general pathological behavior on the internet. In fact, studies indicate that many players who engage regularly with internet gaming and play very seriously, they consider themselves serious gamers, do not have any problems interfering with their other life activities or dysfunction in their other life roles. These researchers, Ferguson and colleagues, have argued that when approaches to this internet gaming disorder focus too heavily on time spent online gaming as a predictor of addicted versus non-addicted players, they actually create a lot of false positives. And you should know what that means because I said it in a prior video. They're calling people internet gaming addicted who really are not. Really are not. And they even say, wait a minute, the rise of esports. In fact, we have one at Damon's campus. We have an esports team, right? The rise of esports seems to be in contradiction to this idea that too much internet gaming could create an addict. That doesn't really make any sense, any more than saying, hey, if you're interested in competing on your college basketball team, you might become a basketball addict. That's a really good way to end this video. Basketball addiction. I'll catch you guys on the class business video. That's all for today. I want you to think about for next class policies. This is going to be our next topic for our last class of the semester, which is on Thursday. Policies that some countries have instituted for limiting internet gaming use for those under the age of 18, and if this makes any modicum of sense. Think about it. Think about it, think about it, think about it, and come back on Thursday. That is it for today's lecture. I'm going to go to class business on our next video. See you in a moment. Oop, I can't close the video.